guys, welcome back to Flipped Psychology. We are still in Unit 2, the biopsychology domain. In this video, we are covering Section 2, the brain and how we study it. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. Today's objectives we're going to cover are identify and describe the major structures of the brain, identify and describe the methodology, including the tools used to study the brain, and we're going to discuss issues related to scientific advantages in neuroscience and genetics. Okay, so here we go. The major structures and functions of the brain. So I want you to think there are two ways that we look at the brain. The first way is kind of inside out, okay? We're looking at the hindbrain first. This is kind of the deepest, most primitive part of the brain. It is the part of the brain that most animals have in common with us. So this part of the brain is involved in many vital functions like heart rate, respiration, and balance. These are things that we don't have to think about doing. Other animals, the smallest animals all the way up to humans, all have a hindbrain basically, and all have those same types of vital functions: heart rate, respiration, balance. Even if there's not a heart, there's some kind of a circulatory system. The midbrain includes areas that are involved in vision and hearing, so we're getting a little bit more complex. Most animals also have some type of vision and hearing, but not all animals do. And then last but not least is the forebrain. So this is going to be the most outer part of the brain, and it is the most complex, especially in humans. This is the front area of the brain, and it's involved in very complex functions like thoughts, emotions, impulse control, planning, dreaming, all of that kind of stuff. So this is just another kind of glimpse into the parts of the brain, and it includes the specific sections of those parts. So in the midbrain, we're talking about the reticular activating system, at least the middle part, because there's also part of the reticular activating system in the lower part of the hindbrain. In the hindbrain, you're also going to find the medulla, the cerebellum, and the pons. And these are all involved in very vital, primitive functions like balance and our sleep rhythms. The forebrain is going to include the upper part of the reticular activating system, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the cerebrum, and the cerebral cortex, which is the surface of the cerebrum. That is the part that's kind of on the outer part of all of the brain. And last but not least, the corpus callosum. This is the part, if you're familiar with looking at models of the brain, it's the part that splits it into hemispheres. And what it does is it's the part of the brain that has communications back and forth from the hemispheres. Another way of looking at the brain is through the lobes of the brain. So let's go through the 4 lobes of the brain. The first one, and I'm going to go a little bit out of order, okay? I'm going to go a little bit out of order. We're going to start with the occipital lobe. It is in the back part of your brain. It's kind of that hump that you feel when you're touching your skull. That is your occipital lobe. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense for your occipital lobe to be where it is, because it is the part of the brain that has visual processing. So when you have information from what you see from your eyes, it is being processed in your occipital lobe, and it's directly behind your eyes. So it makes a lot of sense. Next, I'm going to continue this way, kind of from the back forward. You've got your parietal lobe, and this is where sensation and perception are processed. The sensory areas are for integrating sensory input, mostly with the visual system. It takes a lot of the brain to process visual information. So now I'm going to go back up to the top of your screen where it is the temporal lobe. And what I want you to do is I want you to take your fingers and kind of pretend like you're pushing your hair behind your ears. If you have enough hair, or if you don't, you're just pretending. This is for auditory processing, what you hear. It also processes that information into meaningful units such as speech and words. It's also responsible for memory processing. And that is going to be episodic memory and semantic memory. Just to file that away in your brain We're not going to talk about the different kinds of memory quite yet. Okay, so now I'm jumping back down to the bottom of the page where we're talking about our frontal lobe. This is that front area, frontal lobe. So it sounds like what it is. And this is the part of the brain that is responsible for problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language, initiation, judgment, impulse control, and social and sexual behavior. And this is also where the motor area, the sensory motor area, is found. So if you look at your screen, there are two sensory motor areas. The first part is the sensory area, and it's in the parietal lobe. And so what this shows you are that there are specific parts of the sensory area that are responsible for information from the legs, from the trunk, that's the kind of main part of your body, from the head, from the arms, and so on. You can look at the picture. The motor areas are in the frontal lobe, and this is where your brain is deciding to move those areas. You think you are moving them, but it's actually your brain moving them. So when experiments have been done on the brain, if you are actually exposing the brain and touching the brain with electrodes, you can make that person feel like there is a sensation on specific parts of their body. That's how we know. This isn't just us assuming. We've actually tested this out. Scientists can also make a person move parts of their body without planning to do it. So if they touch the part of the motor area responsible for toes, they can make the person wiggle their toes without them trying to wiggle their toes. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so how do we study the brain? There are a number of ways that we study the brain, and we've been studying the brain for a very long time. One of the things that we're going to be doing in our class is we're going to look into a case study, a gentleman named Phineas Gage, and he lived a very long time ago. He actually had a tamping rod. You see the illustration on your screen. This is a tamping rod that was used on work on the railroads, and that's what he did for a living, and an explosion happened. The tamping rod that he is holding in his hand in the photograph shot through his head. It was there in the explosion, and it shot through his head in the illustration. You can see kind of where the trajectory was. It went up through, like kind of right there by the cheekbone, all the way up through his frontal lobe. And what we were able to do in this case study is we were able to document the changes to Phineas Gage. So accidents are a way to study the brain. This is accidental damage to the brain regions can tell us about the functions of the brain. Lesions are purposeful damage to tissues of the brain, whether it's in an experiment or whether it is through a surgical procedure. We're also going to look at a case study of a person named HM. We refer to him as HM because of confidentiality, but HM had his hippocampus removed, and we were able to document differences in HM after that part of the brain was removed or damaged. So that is studying the brain through lesions. We can also study the brain through electrical stimulation. And through electrical stimulation, also known as deep brain stimulation, researchers and clinicians have been able to determine which areas of the brain respond to visual, auditory, or sensory sensations. I just referred to that when we were talking about the different parts of the brain. There's actually a lot of newer research that shows that deep brain stimulation holds a lot of promise for different neurological disorders. So that's really exciting, and it's brand new, cutting edge. We study the brain through electroencephalogram, or EEG. This is where we do a recording. We attach probes and we record the electrical brain waves. And we already talked about how the brain is electrical and chemical. So this is using the brain's naturally occurring electrical waves to look at different disorders. And researchers can diagnose these disorders by looking at anomalies in the brain waves. We also study the brain through brain imaging, and I'm going to go through a couple of types of brain imaging. These are scans that allow researchers and clinicians to record brain activity, and what you end up with is something like a photograph, and it can be very informative. There are X-rays, there are MRAs, there are MRIs and functional MRIs, CT scans, and PET scans. So MRIs and functional or fMRIs use magnetic resonance imaging. So you're using magnets and radio waves to see the structure of the soft tissue in the brain, or really any part of the body, but we're talking about the brain. So it's unlike an X-ray. MRIs use a huge magnet and radio waves and a computer to create detailed cross-sectional images. So it's almost like taking photographic slices of the soft tissue. fMRIs can measure the tiny changes in blood flow that take place in an active part of the brain. So while you are having an fMRI done, you are doing things like wiggling your toes or maybe even playing a musical instrument. And that way the clinician can see the different parts of the brain light up. We study the brain through CT or CAT scans, and this is computed tomography. So in a CT scan, you are combining data from several X-rays at different positions to produce a detailed image of the structures inside the body. So you're seeing the soft tissue, you're seeing bone. On your screen, you see an illustration of a CT scanning machine. So this is the type where someone goes into the machine and they're taking pictures from different vantage points all the way around that machine. We can study the brain using PET scans. A PET scan stands for positron emission tomography. So in this type of a scan, it is an imaging test that helps reveal how your tissue and organs are functioning. It's basically looking to see how your brain, if we're talking about the brain, is using up glucose. So it's going to use a radioactive drug that's inserted into your bloodstream, and what it's going to do is the different parts of the brain that are using glucose or blood the most are going to light up more than others, and it's going to show your brain's activity. So let's talk about some scientific advances in neuroscience. This is a topic that I could talk about forever, but some that were really interesting to me at the time of producing this video is that we can actually prevent diseases such as Alzheimer's through early interventions like using healthy food and lifestyle choices that reduce typical inflammation that is indicative of Alzheimer's disease. So this is something that's really pretty cutting edge, and this is in neuroscience. Sounds old-fashioned, just eating differently and making different lifestyle changes you wouldn't think would have a huge impact on things like Alzheimer's disease, but we know for a fact now that they do. We also are looking as a science into gene therapies such as therapeutic proteins, antibodies, and gene editing machinery. So this is gene therapy used to reprogram glial cells into functioning neurons in the central nervous system. Glial cells are basically the glue that holds all of it together and makes your central nervous system a system and not just individualized parts. So it's turning those glial cells into functioning neurons, which is really cool. And then another thing that I found just through some basic research was stem cells being used in regenerative medicine. So these stem cells are being used and tested to generate functional neurons for various neurodegenerative diseases. So lots of kind of microscopic at the gene level type of research being done. Pretty cool. Okay, so we are done with section 2, but before you go, you should have a basic understanding of the major structures of the brain. You should have an understanding of how we study the brain, the different ways that we look at the brain. And finally, some of the different issues related to scientific advances in neuroscience. Our next video in the series will be section 3, the endocrine system. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.